and she's going to talk to us a bit, and then we'll have some discussion and questions. So think about, have a good listen, and let's make this a good evening.
Thanks for that, Diana. Yeah, as Diana mentioned, my name is Serisha. I use the pronoun she, her, and I'm calling in today from unceded Algonquin territory, colonially referred to as Ottawa. I'm technically out in Orleans, which is like a little francophone suburb of Ottawa, but that's where I'm currently staying with my family. And yeah, I'll tell you a little bit about my story, but first, in also acknowledging the land that I'm on now, want to acknowledge that my ancestral lands are the kingdom of the Zulu in South Africa. So I'm of Indian ethnic origin, which means my family many generations ago, about 7 or 8, were brought as slaves to South Africa. And the reason why I acknowledge that is because I come from a family of refugees who sought refuge from the apartheid system in South Africa by coming to Canada, not knowing that the Canadian government's residential school system and what was then called the Indian Pass system was very much the framework for which apartheid was developed upon. And so that was information I didn't know until I went to university and had a course on South African history at McGill, being taught by a white American professor about my own history was not the best environment, but it also that's how I found out, and it was information that no one in my family really knew because we didn't have access to it. And so I say that to acknowledge both the land, but also that as a result, I have deep solidarity with Indigenous peoples here in the ongoing genocide that is happening, and definitely encourage folks to pay attention to that, particularly again because the implications of Christians and the church, both in apartheid and in the genocide happening in Canada. So that is my little disclaimer, I guess. But I'll start off with maybe sharing my personal background. So currently, I still identify, I guess, as an evangelical Baptist Christian, but perhaps without sort of the assumptions you might make about that particular group of Christians. Don't worry, I take no offense to it. I grew up in that area and have deep relationships there that I recognize are very different to other denominations. But my parents were married in a United Church, and I'll get to that a little bit later. So my sort of experience with Christianity starts probably before I was even born. So I come from, like I mentioned, my ancestors were enslaved peoples. And my grandparents on my father's side, as well as my father himself, were all very, very strict Hindus. Hinduism is not a religion in the same way that Christianity or Islam or Judaism is, the way we see the Abrahamic traditions. It's very deeply rooted in culture. It's rooted in something called the caste system that we have in India. And it's not necessarily something you can convert away from. There's no conversion process to no longer be a Hindu, the same way that there's no conversion process for somebody who is not born into the caste system to then become a Hindu, which is why you get people like the Hare Krishnas, or if you're familiar with John Lennon as one of the more popular followers of Hinduism who cannot really be Hindu because there's no conversion process. And so my parents or my grandparents were very, very religious Hindus and followed it not just as a cultural premise, but as a religious premise. So they observed things that included things like self-flagellation and walking on fire and hooking carts to their back as ceremony. So very, very strict is what I'm trying to get at. And that I don't think is isolated to Hinduism. We see Christians all over the world partake in things like that, particularly around Easter. But that's the kind of environment they were coming from. And as their children grew up, their children started attending, my oldest aunt and I believe a couple of my older uncles started attending a local church that was an evangelical church in South Africa. And there's a very big difference between the evangelical churches that exist there that are more, to my recollection, British enforced, particularly because at this time of apartheid, they were all segregated by race, right? So it was an Indians only church taught by Indians, and no other race was involved. But that also meant that it was separated from the Dutch Reformed Church, which was the church that was helping to implement apartheid in South Africa, or the system of segregation. And so they started going to this church. I don't have a lot of the context or details. My father and most of his siblings have since passed, so I don't have access to that knowledge. But they went to this church and they started coming home and telling their parents about what they were learning, about, I presume, Jesus and whatever stories they were learning at church. And one day, the best way that I've been told the story is that one day my grandmother started having visions of Jesus when she would go to sleep. So like dreams and very lucid visions of Jesus. And then they just became Christians as a result, which is something that I personally not experienced, but has been the foundation, I guess, of the faith that I grew up in. But the thing that they did was then they sort of created this anti-Hindu perspective within their own internalized racism and their own internalized issues around Christianity. So they were very, very Christian. As strictly as they were Hindus, they had become as strictly Christian. So super conservative, very, very staunch and strict, and evangelical, right? And so that was the upbringing that I had, that my grandparents were, both my grandparents lived with me, and my parents when I was growing up. And so I had that influence, and my dad had been raised in a Christian home and in that strict Christian environment. So that like helped in my upbringing, I guess. But my mom was not a Christian, or like a Christian convert, born again, whatever language you want to use. She came from a Hindu background, raised in Hindu families, both her biological and adopted, and then was forced to convert when she married my dad. And that was something that was done very violently, and not without issues of consent, right? So there was no consent given for that. My grandparents, like I said, were very staunch, and so they threw out all of her prayer materials and her statues and idols and things like that. And she was just forced to get baptized and convert to Christianity. But her story doesn't end in that sort of negative way. She started going to church by taking her children and going with my dad, her husband, and one day met a woman on a train in Montreal, who had gone to the same church as her, and she gave her a Bible, and like in the very evangelical way that Bibles are all marked up and like got highlights in them and verses written all over the place and notes, gave her that Bible, and my mom started reading it. And that's when she says that she like really came to Christ, is the evangelical thing that they say. And so it is a story of trauma, obviously, and of colonialism. But I also think there's deep privilege in that, because I know so many people were not privy to a relationship that way, particularly in South Africa, when it comes to the relationship Indigenous peoples there have with Christianity, given the violence of colonialism that exists. So that's the upbringing that I was raised in. I was raised in a Christian home. I've always gone to evangelical Baptist churches. That's where my family is rooted. We only read KJV. If you pull out an NIV Bible in my house, that is not appropriate. And so a lot of that very old school traditional Christianity, very deeply conservative, was what I was raised with, and conservative in perhaps not like political ideology, because again, we're obviously racialized people, and come from a refugee immigrant background, so we have different political lenses, but that the sort of the social issues, the homophobia, the transphobia, all of the rest of it, was certainly there. And so that was the environment that I was raised in. But as Diana mentioned, so I spent most of my life growing up in Georgetown, but before that I lived in Brampton, for about 4 years. And in Brampton, I also attended a Baptist church. I don't know if you'll have heard of Calvary Baptist Church. There's like a million Calvary Baptist churches. But the one that I went to in Brampton, I credit for like me still being a Christian today, in spite of the sort of racial violence that I think the churches, or like capital C church, has conducted against racialized people. When I was there, I like grew up in the church. The church was my safe place. Like I remember sleeping on the pews. It was a very old Baptist church, like sleeping on the pews during evening service, like as a child at like 8 o'clock when my parents were singing and I'd be like fast asleep on the pew. My pastor he was a ventriloquist. And so he used to tell us Bible stories up at the front with his little puppets. And we had teachers who were all racialized. So I had a few white Bible study teachers, but the ones who were most prominent in my life were a Pakistani convert and then a Black man. And those two really solidified and an Indian woman, actually, now that I think about it. So I had racialized adults teaching me about Jesus and about the Bible. And I think that made a huge difference in the way that I perceived who Jesus was and is, and how I perceived God or the image of God in both myself and in other people. And so having that sort of upbringing didn't allow me, I guess, the suffering of dealing with like white Christianity in that way until I moved to Georgetown. So if any of you know anything about Georgetown, it is like 99% white. It is extremely racist, extremely violent. And I, like, my family just left this year, and I'm forever grateful that I am out of that place. It is not a safe environment for anybody who is not rich and white. And so my church, though, was still a big part of my life. So I would go, if you've ever heard of Maple Avenue Baptist Church, that's my church over there. But I would go to church. I was there like 4 or 5 times a week doing like Awana leadership and youth group, and then Sunday service. And we would have Sunday school in the mornings as well, which doesn't seem to be very common in Ottawa. Like there's no 9 a.m. sort of Sunday school. I don't know if that's just a evangelical thing or what. But so very much to say that I was involved in the church, like very vigorously. And it was then that I started noticing when I left sort of the Sunday school area, and in grade 6, I think, is when we were allowed to sit in on the bigger congregation and just listen to the pastor. That was when I noticed a gigantic shift. And so maybe I'll issue a content warning just for like rampant homophobia, perhaps, or just anti-LGBTQI sort of discourse from evangelicals. But I noticed a very distinct shift between what I had learned in Brampton versus what I was learning in Georgetown, in that like people were preaching hate, and that was not what I knew Jesus to be, whether it was racism or whether it was the world was going to end in 2012 because gay marriage became legal in the US or something stupid like that. And it really did not sit well with me. I was surrounded by people who were uberly conservative in both their socialization and their political ideology. We've had the same member of parliament since I moved there for 10 years or longer, obviously a conservative. And so that ideology was very much entrenched in the town, because you're also dealing with people who come from quite wealthy backgrounds, and that ties into a lot of things around privilege as well as socioeconomic class. And it wasn't sitting right with me, and it didn't allow me, I think, to flourish in the same way that I did at my old church. And mind you, I was in church in Georgetown for way longer than anywhere else. And at the time, I was also dealing and struggling with very, very severe mental health issues, and being told that my mental health issues meant that I was just a sinner, and that like content warning for perhaps suicidal ideation, that like if I were to kill myself, that God would be upset with me, and that I was destroying everything around me because of those thoughts. And so I knew in my heart that wasn't true. Like I knew that what I was being told was not reflective of what I was reading in the Bible, was not reflective of what who I knew God to be, who I knew Jesus to be. And I had enough self-awareness and sort of critical thinking to be able to hold on to that. And the thing that really sort of was a turning point for me was when I was in grade 12, I was in the IB program, if you ever heard of that. And so we studied what they called at the time the Arab-Israeli conflict, referring to Palestine and Israel. And our high school history teacher put us in groups based on what he thought our political ideologies were. So we had a few kids who were also racialized, who came in from neighboring towns for this program. They didn't actually live in Georgetown like I did. and they were all on one side, and their side was to be pro-Israel. And he put the rest of us, which was me and my friends, on the other side, and our task was to be pro-Palestine in this debate. And a friend of mine who is very much now a white supremacist, and I don't associate with them obviously anymore, he made a comment and was like, hey, did you notice he's looping us in by political ideology? Like he wants us to be on these opposite sides so that we learn whatever the other side is thinking, sort of thing. And I remember him saying like, oh, well, it's like there's no real debate here because Israel is in the Bible and that's it. And so I went home and I told my dad what had happened. And for context, my dad was a freedom fighter in South Africa, and South Africa and Palestine have very large solidarity complexes within the both of them based on the colonialism that they've dealt with. And I went home and I told him this, and I was like, he was very confused, I think, as to why I had been looped in with my friends who were very, very conservative rather than the racialized folks who were from other towns. And I told him, well, Israel's in the Bible, so that's true, and that's all it is. Like this is the reality. And I don't think I've ever seen him so disappointed and embarrassed and just like, what is wrong with you kind of deal. And then he educated me, and that's when the sort of shift in my mind happened, I think. My parents have always been more liberal than I think most parents who are from evangelical backgrounds are. But it wasn't ever like a racial identity or a political identity until that moment for me. And so when I went off to university, I realized I had a lot of work to do. And very luckily, McGill has quite intensive training for new people who come into the school to unlearn a lot of the oppressive behaviors and thinkings that we've learned. And that was a huge benefit to me. And so while I was there, I decided, I'm originally from Montreal, so I decided to go back to the church that I technically grew up in as a child. It was where I was christened. It was like I was very involved in church from a very, very young age. So my my sort of biggest memories are like having a huge christening party with all the church people coming over, kind of thing. And so I decided to go back there. And I realized that the preaching I was getting there was very, very different than the preaching I was getting in Georgetown. And it was not as progressive, perhaps, as the United Church in general, but far more progressive than what I was used to dealing with. And that really spoke to me. And so as a result, I started to sort of unlearn a lot of things. I then decided to study world religions with a focus on Christianity, which I thought was going to be like Sunday school. It was not. But having a sort of academic lens on what I believed and being in class with theologians really helped me to deconstruct my Christianity and actually strengthened my belief, I think. I was in school with a lot of pastors, and there's a theological school at McGill. And so everyone was a lot older than me, but it was the first time I'd ever met queer Christians, for example. I'd never been around queer Christians before, and didn't know that was possible. And so that sort of experience pushed me to really deconstruct, like I said, my Christianity. And then fast forward a few years as my political ideology and things changed, in association with my Christianity, I found just last year this organization called Decolonizing Christianity Canada, which is where Diana met, I think is where how you know Rose Ingrid. And those folks have just like changed my life in terms of decolonizing my faith, looking at what that looks like, coming to terms with certain things around trying to decolonize while also being a Christian, what that means, learning how to live with myself as a Christian while doing decolonizing work. Because like I said, I am big on Indigenous solidarity. And so a lot of the work I do is associated with that. And that comes at the expense of criticizing the church on a whole, right? Because they're the ones who put this in practice, these systems of oppression. And so that's where I'm at today. And continuously learning, continuously trying to unpack sort of the racisms and things that I experience in the church, that I think for the most part, I was very ignorant to because it was my safe place. Because I valued church so much, because I had so many friends there, because I got along with my pastors, and most importantly, I think because I had such a safe upbringing around Christianity at my oldest church, I didn't notice when things were being said necessarily that were super homophobic or super racist until a certain age. And so now that I've gotten there and I understand it, there's more to do. And so part of the work that I like to do is when I left university, I applied for a job at an organization that I don't know if you're familiar with, but they're an ecumenical organization called Citizens for Public Justice out of Ottawa. And when I found, I think I like at 2:00 in the morning, found their website, and it was progressive Christians basically. And I was like, what is this? Where on earth have these people been my whole life? Like, what is this? And I applied, and I got rejected. But I didn't want to come to Ottawa. I like was super against it. And I knew that if I got that job, that would mean that God was calling me to come to Ottawa. I didn't get it. I ended up working in Toronto for a year, being able to like purchase a car and all these cool things. And then I reapplied because I was so miserable at my old job. And I was like, something is telling me, not something, you're all Christians. God is telling me to go to Ottawa for whatever reason. And so I reapplied and I got hired on the spot. And I spent a year as their refugee rights intern, sort of running their work there. And it was the first time I'd ever heard of the word ecumenical. People had to explain it to me several times because, like I said, evangelicals don't operate in that way. And it introduced me not just to progressive Christianity, I think, but that there were white people who would listen in that way, and white people who could recognize their racism, both intentionally and unintentionally, and people who were willing to put in the work to make changes, both policy-wise, personally-wise, and then on a systemic level as a result of that policy and advocacy. And that, I think, gave me a little bit of hope that there could be changes made to the church. And so often I think I've now met so many people who have left their churches or left Christianity altogether because of the harm specifically of racism or homophobia or other intersections that exist. Like ableism, for example, is another one that I've heard. And I always say that, like, at this point in my life, I think I've left the capital C church, but I'll never leave Jesus is kind of the way I think about it. That I'm less concerned with this formal structure of a church and more concerned with like being the hands and feet on earth kind of thing. And so that's credited, I think, to a lot of my experience at CPJ and doing policy work in a way that was influenced by Christianity, but very different to a lot of the other lobbying folks in Ottawa who are Christian. In fact, quite opposite, I would say, from what they're doing. And that's where I came to today, right? Where now I'm able to speak to different churches and to different groups and to different people about my experiences in the church and how I recognize both the privileges that I've had, but also the fact that like the church as a whole and Christianity as a whole is a colonial, has a colonial impact. And decolonizing that means like looking at the facts and how, for example, Christianity is not a Western religion in reality. Like we can look at a map and see where Syria is and see where Egypt is and Ethiopia and look at how the travels went down and recognize sort of that the Church of England were not the ones who created this. And I think that's hard for a lot of people to accept, largely because they don't have access to that knowledge or don't have the capacity to do that learning or are not in environments where that learning is welcomed, which is very visceral of an example of the evangelical churches that exist. There is no opportunity for that discourse the way that there is in a church like the United Church, for example. And so not that that's probably a broad stroke. I'm sure there are some churches that don't allow that within the United Church, but that it's not as difficult, I think, of a conversation to grasp. Whereas for my community, it's incredibly hard for them to admit that they've done anything wrong, that they're complicit in any way, and that anything has to do with Christianity at all. For them, it's all God's will. And I wasn't willing to put up with that anymore. So yeah, so then when I got that job at CPJ, I now work at Amnesty International, which is a separate thing, but I work in human rights and I approach a lot of things from a human rights framework, including Christianity. And that comes to things like missions, for example, are huge in evangelical churches. I'm of the mindset that missions are just new age colonialism personally, and don't do much for the environment. I've gotten into it with my pastors about that, much to their dismay. Um, but that I think is where I'm at, is learning about the harms that we do and how we can mitigate it. So when I was at CPJ, the thing that I like to say a lot of the time as my sort of definition of what I was doing and not theirs is that we were undoing the work that other Christians had done, was really the goal. So when it came to racism, when it came to sexism, when it came to poverty, to all the systems that are at play that were put together by sort of white conservative Christians, the goal for me was to undo that. And find a way that was constructive and beneficial to the oppressed, in order to do that. And yeah, and so so that's why I do things like this now. I very much feel called to work with Christian organizations. With my work with Leading in Color, that was probably to nobody's surprise. I had a dream that God was telling me to do this, and I did it. And it has been very successful. And I'm a firm believer that it's been successful because it was not me who created this, and that's why we continue to do well. But through that, I've had the opportunity to sort of do consulting, and talking through sort of discussion-based questions and things with Christian organizations who are willing and interested to have difficult conversations, particularly around racism. And doing that work as a consultant has been, I think, the most fulfilling of the work, because I, for whatever reason, still believe that the church can change, and that we can sort of take it back, I guess, from a oppressed people's perspective. And I'm very committed to doing that because I know that I've benefited from it. I know that the way I was raised has influenced my work ethic, my belief system, my value system. I have absolutely no doubt in terms of like where God has worked in my life at all, even if I've been disillusioned by the capital C church. Like I said, like I may have left that church, but I will never leave Jesus. And so that's where my sort of strength and ideology lies. And yeah, and as a result, I get to have conversations like this. And so that's kind of my story, I guess. But maybe I'll open it to see if anyone has any comments or questions before I talk more, also so that I can get a sip of water.
Any comments from people? Any questions? Any observations?
I'm just wondering what you hope an evening like this accomplishes for you.
Yeah, I think
For us, yeah.
I think it's always important to be able to hear these sort of stories, but I also think that so many of the people, like I said, have left the church, if not Christianity altogether. And that's totally fine. That's their prerogative, right? And like that's what's best for them. I know that that's not what's best for me. And I very much feel that there are people who probably have had similar experiences to me, where the church has been a place of safety for them, but also a place of harm. Um, and that maybe they'll get disillusioned enough to leave. And if that's on their own terms, sure. But if it's on if it's because they're being pushed out, that is what I want to be able to change, is to speak to that. And I think a big part of that comes from educating and speaking with the people who are in the congregations around them, right? How do you work to make this place safer? Who do you challenge when it comes to pastoral administration? When it comes to the theology that you're learning? Do you look at things like liberation theology and womanist theology to get information from? Is that something that exists within your denomination? It is certainly not within mine. Absolutely not, but it is in my personal interest. And so yeah, I think to be able to just reflect on what's being said, but also take it as sort of a call to action for you to make spaces safer. And I can suggest things if there's questions around how to build a safer environment in the church. But yeah, I think that is sort of the biggest takeaway.
I guess I would like to follow that up with asking that question. How can we make it a safer place for people? Do you have
Yeah,
some
absolutely.
practical suggestions for that?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is doing sort of your own independent work on things like anti-racism and how to be anti-racist, how to be. I think the United Church is probably way ahead of others when it comes to being affirming, but I heard there are still issues within the sort of corporate structure of the churches. Again, the United Church and Anglican churches and other churches don't operate the way we do. So like your moderators or your I can't remember the other words, but I know there's like councils and things like that. Whereas evangelical churches like me, they belong to like FEB International, which is the Fellowship of Evangelical Baptists, and whatever they say is whatever it is. And our head pastors are the ones who determine all of our theology. It has nothing to do with outside sort of sources. It's whoever their head pastor is. So I think in a church like yours, where you have sort of infrastructure in place to be able to challenge things, is really helpful. So looking at what their hiring practices are, looking at what's being done around things like anti-racism, challenging them to do more about it. If you talk to people in your congregation, I'm sure they will tell you, if you make it a comfortable enough space, I'm sure they will tell you about the racism that they've experienced, because they want people to know, right? And so often it's just ignored. People don't listen. And so I think one of the best things you can do is to listen to your peers and listen to the people that you're in fellowship with and that you're in community with, and hear what they have to say. Because so much of this is structural, that will go beyond sort of your individual capacities in terms of the systemic forms of oppression that exist. But on the interpersonal level, you can intervene when something is wrong. So if somebody tells you they've had a racist or homophobic or ableist experience at church, you being able to step forward and with their consent, support them in a way by either taking it to whoever your lead pastor is, or suggesting a change. An example I can give maybe around ableism in particular is like, so sometimes churches have like 2 floors, and not everybody can climb up the stairs. And so people have advocated for like getting ramps and getting lifts or elevators in, which might seem small, but is something that will help deter from systems of oppression. And so racism is one that I think, frankly, until the churches collectively recognize that like white supremacy was created by the church, I don't know that the systemic level will change anything. And so what you can do to the best of your ability is support those who are around you. And if that means doing your own education most of the time, I think that's the first step. So like rather than asking your friends or your peers how sort of to be anti-racist in that way, do the sort of research on your own. I can make recommendations as well for some content, but doing that research and doing that work internally to recognize your own sort of biases and your own your own historical, I guess, oppression with racism. Like everybody perpetuates it and everybody benefits from it. And so doing that work internally is really big. And then once you've done that, you're able to support the people around you. And I think that's the biggest impact that you can have at this point, for sure.
Thank you.
Serisha, I want to thank you for sharing your story so far, and I just want to encourage you. I'm the past president of one of the regions across the United Church of Canada, and the United Church this past fall has come out with an anti-racist statement, a policy, and it's a journey. It's something we need to just keep working on. I am a member of the LGBTQ community. I have suffered at the hands of the church, and I have flourished at the hands of the church. And I think one of the key words here is education. We need to share our stories. We need to create safe spaces where people know that they are safe and cared for and will not be hurt. The church has hurt people, there's no question. And my partner and I do a lot of work around LGBTQ initiatives and making places safe as best we can. For sure, there's no doubt, many of our churches are 99% white. And it's hard for us to to engage in being an anti-racist church when we're all colonial, if you will. Okay, so it's a case of education, and I think as we work hard to get our resources in place and we encourage communities of faith to be strong, and the region executives need to step up and are starting to step up with all sorts of programming and workshops and resources to help folks move forward. I think that's part of the key. But thanks for sharing your story so far.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think investment into this work is a big thing. Like, I think so often we pretend that churches don't have money, and that's just simply not true. We, particularly when it comes to like the Catholic Church, for example, has billions of dollars. But churches in general have money. And that's because more often than not, the people who attend church are wealthy and white, and they have access to that money. They have, whether it was obtained sort of ethically or not in regards to colonialism and intergenerational wealth, but that's why that is happening. And so those funds can be used very, very specifically to support communities in need. So like churches I've been a part of might have a benevolence fund, for example, to help poor people out in their community. And usually that's like $2,000. Meanwhile, the new basketball court is like $55,000. And that's a huge discrepancy, right? And so looking at investment, at redistribution of wealth and of knowledge is really important. The other thing I want to note is just around sort of anti-racism statements and things like that, is that there can be this disillusionment, I think, with people within the church, within the sort of broad structures of churches, that when a statement like that is released, but they're still experiencing harm internal to their congregation or internal to the church system, that it's futile, right? Like that it's moot. It doesn't matter because of that. And so just to be cognizant of there continue to be, and the only reason I say this is because I know people within the United Church, is that I know that there continues to be structures of racism and experiences of racism and homophobia, et cetera, that you've mentioned. And a statement addressing that can sometimes just serve to harm those people even more when nothing is being done to fix what's happening on the inside. And so that's maybe one thing, sort of putting the cart before the horse sometimes, that I think churches do. I think the Anglican Church also released quite a bizarre statement last year or similar on anti-racism that was actually quite a racist statement. And so sometimes things like that happen. And to be cognizant of it and to challenge it in your leadership when that does happen, to be able to call them out and say that like this is inappropriate or this was not done correctly is huge. And not always will the people who are being affected by it be able to speak up and do that because of the inherent power imbalances that exist. And so if you're somebody who does have privilege and power in whatever way that manifests, being able to not speak on behalf of people, but to witness what's happening and to speak on that is really, really important.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We are moving. It's a journey, and we recognize that. And we have put in place at the national level a position where Adele Holiday, a Black woman, is responsible for helping create the resources and motivate activity around anti-racism and equity. We see those as side-by-side concerns and issues. So it's a journey for sure. And we've been working at it for 4 decades, 5 decades, and we'll be working at it for another 5 decades. But as long as we all work together and we listen to each other, we'll make some progress.
Yeah, I think what Sheila said is true. Like, what practical things can we do? Because to be honest, a lot of well-meaning people do a lot of things and haven't a clue that what they're doing is not right. Like I mentioned to you about what happened here in the region. It was just, I talked to the people that were part of the program, that I talked to some other people that worked there, and they thought they were doing something good. And they so totally missed the mark that it was.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the key things that I run into a lot is that people, both with the region of Durham thing, I'm shocked kind of that people didn't pick up on that, because the minute I saw it, I was like, what do you mean dance to a reggae song? what.
Yeah.
But
I have a friend who, a black gentleman who works in a department where he is the only black person. They said, you couldn't have talked to me the other 364 days of the year.
Exactly.
He was really insulted.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing is, as well as that, anti-oppression and equity as a skill set is learned and done through both education, experience, and not necessarily formal education in the way that we think of education, but education and experience. And not everybody, even if they are Black, Indigenous, or racialized, has that skill set, right? So they could be just as equally internalized in their racism as somebody who's white is external in their racism. And I think that is probably the issue that Durham region ran into with that, is that you need to have that skill set. And that skill set is something, for example, with the background that I come from, like you folks have heard, had I not gone to McGill as a specific university, if I had gone to like Western or Guelph with the rest of my friends, or Queens, very predominantly white schools with the rest of my high school friends, I don't know that I would have had that same education. I don't know that I would have had people quite viscerally calling me out and saying your internalized racism is a problem and it's negatively impacting your relationships and you need to do something about it. And that's the same sort of approach I use with other people, is that if you can't see it because you're too sort of internalized to it, it's very hard to do something about it. And so in terms of practical skills, I think the biggest thing is to educate yourself, and critically think from your own perspectives. Because if you're reading something, like the big name out there right now is Robin DiAngelo and her book White Fragility. But if you're paying money to purchase a book from a white woman who's benefiting off of the oppression of racialized people in order to learn what racism is and what you're doing incorrectly, that in and of itself is white supremacy. And so being able to critically think about that is also a skill, and one that needs to be developed. And I think more often than not, I'll speak again to the evangelical church, and my experience is that we're just told and told and told and told, and we absorb. And there's no option to critically think about it. It's like, this is wrong because of this. That's the end. And so that's why I say there's also an element of privilege in being in the church space that you're in now, that you have access to be able to think critically about these things and educate yourself in a way that many Christians unfortunately do not have access to, regardless of their race, but because of their denomination, because of their theology. And until people can sort of tap into that, I don't know how they'll get there. But I would suggest like things like reading books and educating yourself that way, listening to podcasts, following people, if you use social media, following people on social media, but not just absorbing things for the sake of absorbing it. Like really think critically about who is saying what and why they are saying it. And that applies to racialized folks too. Like people become activists and then become celebrities, and you see very quickly their politics and their ideology change once that element of upper class or high class is a part of the conversation. They move from sort of a grassroots activist space to a celebratory sort of rich people space, and then things change in the way that they operate. And so, yeah, so self-education is the biggest thing. And then if that is not something that is within your capacity, suggesting and encouraging that your churches provide spaces to learn like this, like spaces where you can hear stories, spaces where you can have critical analysis, do activities, learn from one another, share and discuss as a group your different experiences and what that looks like, and build sort of community agreements on how you want to behave in that environment in order to make it safe for everybody is I think the best and a critical way of going about this, because it is such a large issue, right? It is a systemic issue, and what you're going to be focused on is interpersonal sort of connection. So yeah, so again, the redistribution of wealth, and this self-education, I think, are the two biggest pieces in terms of practical steps that you can take.
I realize this is a very specific question, but you brought up white fragility, and I'm wondering if you have a recommendation for a book. Like I wondered if we could have a book study, even on Zoom, where, you know, we read a chapter and then we get together to discuss it, on like finding those places of racism within ourselves. that we're not aware of. Do you have any recommendation for?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can tell you that that's something that my friends at Decolonizing Christianity Canada, we also started a book club where we're reading, the first book we're reading is called On La Lucha. I'll put it in the chat. Actually, maybe I'll just post all of them in the chat afterwards.
Yeah, you can email everything to me and I'll.
Oh, perfect. Great. But so we're reading about Maharista theology. And so that is theology that comes from Latin America, from women in particular. And that's something that I don't have much experience or knowledge about at all. Another one, I'll show you maybe the couple that are on my reading list actually from Christmas. Oh, I don't know if you can see it. Okay. Who Will Be a Witness? So Igniting Activism for God's Justice, Love, and Deliverance. Decolonizing Evangelicalism. I'll send these out, but there are people who are doing this, particularly Black and Indigenous folks, most of whom come from the US because they're a little bit more available there readily. But yeah, there are people who are doing this that you can read and learn from, who both have the lived experience and the critical analysis and sort of critical thinking around racism and anti-racism and what that looks like specifically in the churches.
Good, thank you.
But that book club is a great idea. Like, I would highly encourage, if that's something, particularly within this pandemic, that you're able to do, that is a fantastic idea. Yeah. I don't know if anyone else has any questions.
I have one. Could you explain what you mean by decolonizing faith?
Yeah. So for me, decolonizing my faith is trying to take out white Christianity from what I've learned. So first and foremost, this idea of white Jesus, who, if we say that we're all made in the image of God, is certainly not true as an existence. And also just like proven that Jesus was not white based on where he was from. He's not this blonde or light brown haired, blue-eyed man that once existed, right? And that's something that we can prove. So often I think that the sort of atheistic challenge to Christianity is, what can you prove and what can you not? But that is something that as Christians who believe in this, that's something we need to be able to prove to ourselves. And so decolonizing looks like changing that image in my head. It also looks like me bringing back, like I said before, Hinduism is not something you can convert away from. You're born into the caste system, you die into the caste system. It's who you are. So much of that has been distorted because of my family's history with slavery. So you'll notice my last name isn't up there anymore, but my last name is Iyar, spelled Iyar, which is actually a month in the Jewish calendar. So a lot of people think I'm Jewish and then look at me and they're like, oh, are you a convert to Judaism? And I don't have the patience to explain to them no. But that's because my sort of caste last name would have been spelled Iyar, which is the Brahmin or priest caste in South India. I don't know if that's true because the slaves changed their last names to higher caste names and all this kind of jazz. But decolonizing looks like, one, addressing the fact that these churches were the ones that brought my family as slaves, and the companies that brought them as slaves were run by Christians, the Dutch and the British and the Portuguese. Looks like taking into account, from, again, going back to the Hinduism thing, like I listen to Hindu mantras a lot. I find them very peaceful. With sort of the cultural appropriation around yoga right now, that's happened for years, but like yoga is a spiritual practice in Hinduism. It's very, very deeply religious, and yet it's been commodified. And so I have this mentality of like, if colonizers and in particular white folks who benefit from my culture and my customs and my traditions and my spirituality are able to do so, why do I feel so much shame and hatred and sort of displeasure with myself when I listen to a Hindu mantra? Why do I feel guilty about that when that's my culture? And so, or why do I feel guilty about doing yoga? Or why do I feel guilty about practicing my own traditions and cultures? When in reality, like technically God gave them to me, right? That's my mentality, is that my culture and my history were given to me by God, and my practices were as well. So incorporating things like burning incense, or what we call agarbatti, is a very spiritual thing to cleanse the environment that we're in. I do that very often now. And so bringing in those practices and trying to, quite honestly, trying to not hate myself for them is how I practice decolonization. And then also with the work that I do around Indigenous solidarity and working with peoples who have been negatively impacted by Christianity and by the churches. And that includes myself when it comes to apartheid, and speaking like to my mom and making her understand intergenerationally that, like, no, what happened to you is not okay. And the fact that the churches endorsed it and helped build that system and supported that system is not okay. And that we have a right to be upset, and we have a right to be angry about it. And that anger is inherently righteous. And that as oppressed peoples, that anger is inherently righteous. So it looks different, honestly, day to day. But I think taking care to bring sort of my full identity together, and not have it be like the white Christians in my head being like, what you're doing is sinful, and what you're doing is blasphemous, or is witchcraft, or whatever. And embodying my culture is something that I do to very actively try and decolonize it. And I'm still learning. This is not something that I've gone through for years and years. It's very recent change. And even now, if I pick a Hindu mantra to listen to, I'm like, why am I not listening to a worship song instead? And then I'm like, well, do I want to support Hillsong and Bethel and all of their nonsensical music when they're doing harm to the Christians in their communities, right? And so battling with that every day is very difficult, but it's something that I very actively try to do. So I think that's how I do it for now, and maybe I'll learn more in the future.
Thank you.
This must be very hard on you emotionally, just to hear the pain that you express as you talk, and you live with that, fighting with those issues inwardly as well as externally all the time. How do you take care of yourself?
Yeah, it is a lot. And I think for my sort of saying that I always use is that, like, for my whole life, my friends come to me for help and I go to God for help. And that's been my experience, I think. But I think this past year, when I found a group like Decolonizing Christianity Canada and found people who are doing the same thing, has been personally my saving grace. And that was only meeting with them once a month for the past year. And we had a retreat that I'm somebody who suffers from social anxiety quite badly. Unless I'm in a professional setting, as much as I appear very extroverted, I'm incredibly shy and incredibly introverted when I'm not in sort of a speaking publicly role, and in more of a social setting. And that was the first time that I met a group of strangers online and then drove 4 hours or 5 hours to Niagara Falls to meet them all. And I had no fear at all. And so I maintain that, like, what I said before about leaving the church but not leaving Jesus still stands. Like, I'm very evangelical still. And so the language that I use is around that, but like I get my strength from God. All of it comes from Jesus. And so I don't, the pain isn't as hard when that is there. And so that's what I tend to think of. Like, when I feel that guilt and when I feel that shame that, like, is very much white Christianity's ear or speaking in my ear, I very much like listen to that voice that is like, it's not true. And that I know it's not true because, like, I've experienced God in my life in a way that I don't think I could express properly in testimony per se. And so that is truly, I think, where it comes from. And Diana mentioned leading in color before, and how I told you I had a dream about starting that, and it came true in terms of, like, really feeling God calling me to do that anti-racism work and educating racialized youth on how to do what I'm doing and deconstructing sort of the pain and anger and everything around it, and then advocating for ourselves and advocating for our communities and what that looks like. And so yeah, I think that's why I'm still standing, quite frankly, is like, just is Jesus. I don't know what else to tell people. And other folks don't always get it, right? Like a lot of people want to attribute, well, they'll attribute it to resilience, or they'll attribute it to like good self-care. I don't even know what self-care is. Like I listen to worship music and cry. And that's what gets me through the day. So yeah, so that's what I attribute it to always.
Yeah, I think our congregation is no different than many congregations in this area. We're predominantly white. We're predominantly middle class. We're not Georgetown.
No.
My brother's the rich white guy in Georgetown. I am not. Um, but it's like you want to do the right thing and you want to say the right thing, and then you don't necessarily know what that is. And if I mean, it's not like we don't have people of color in our congregation, but you don't want to go up to them and say, so what have I done that I shouldn't have done, or what would you like me to like? I have a friend who is gay, and he says that he doesn't like people coming up to him and saying, so what do I do to be better for all you gay people? It's like, what do you do?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where, again, the self-education is the biggest thing. And the one thing that I say quite often to groups that are, whenever I do talk to groups that are Christian, they inevitably end up being mostly white. But the thing that I say to them that I don't say to other white folks when I do this work is that I know your heart. And I think that speaks very differently to Christians, because I do follow the belief that like intent doesn't matter, that it's the impact that's what's important. And so whether you meant to harm somebody or not, if the harm was caused, that's what it is. But I think when it comes to building community together and trying to resolve these issues of oppression within the church, that's where the intent comes in for me. Not to excuse anything by any means, but to say that we are collectively trying to model our lives after this particular person that we follow. And if we're going to do that, we need to get on the same page. And in order to get on the same page, people need to sort of leave their egos at the door when it comes to the folks who are doing the oppressing. And more often than not, you'll find that those who have been hurt, I think, are the most willing to mend things. And so just following that, I think, is helpful. And this idea that like we are collectively trying to emulate the same thing, but that image that we've been given has been so viciously and violently distorted. And so in order for us to have any sort of collective experience in this, we need to be able to reconfigure that image of God and reconfigure what it stands for, and do so in a way that is to our collective benefit. And so that's what I think of when I approach work in the churches like this, as opposed to externally, is that it comes down, I think, to your theology. My politics are very heavily influenced by my theology. And my politics, if you haven't guessed, are quite left-leaning. And I very much believe that is the application of Jesus's teachings, is why my political values are there. And so I get very confused when for other folks it's the opposite way. But that's what it is for me. And so if you're able to build on that within your community and structure that exists, then I think that's all we can really do at this point, is to ensure that those interpersonal relationships are done in a way that is moving towards this collective sort of oneness in God, but oneness that demonstrates victory of the oppressed, for example, because that's what we're taught in the New Testament, right? And so yeah, so that is really where I get it from, and that's what I use to sort of ground me and ground the people that I talk to about this stuff when it's specifically about the church.
We know that only about 8% of United churches are affirming, and although we are affirming, and we had, I think, a 93% in favor of the vote. There's still that question about, like, I'm pretty certain there are gay folks who come to our service, but they're not out. And you would hope that somehow we'd be a place where people could feel free to be out. And I know it's, I mean, one of these sessions we had was a gay man who's a chaplain downtown, just retired anyway. But he was saying every time he goes into a new group of people, especially if his partner's with him, but even if he isn't, there's always anxiety and fear that, you know, someone will, even if they don't say anything, they're going to be frowning or. So I don't know how to change that dynamic. I mean, I think as a church, majority of us are, you know, wanting to put our arms around the gay folks like we put our arms around each other all the time. How to do that? How to, you know, part of me wants to, a very small part of me wants to go to one of these people that I'm pretty sure is gay and say, you know, are you, and would you be willing to share your story with us? I'm not going to do that, but it's one of the things I've been thinking about trying. How do we get there? How do we get there? So I mean, we say we're affirming, but how do we make that a reality for the people who are part of us?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the biggest thing there is that the onus, like the way that you mentioned, never actually doing that, right? The onus can't be on the people who are being oppressed to educate us. And so I think like that's again where that self-education piece comes in. In order to change the culture, we have to change the education processes of the institutions we're a part of. So for example, like when it comes to theology, are you having like regular preachings on this subject, right? And how it's impacting people in the church. For example, I grew up in a very homophobic environment for the most part in terms of church. But my dad used to be like, if they think I'm gonna stop watching Ellen DeGeneres, they have another thing coming. And so I didn't have that in my house necessarily. Ellen DeGeneres has her own sort of racism issues, but at the time that was what impacted me. And so when I went to university and for the first time had friends who were gay, I was able to respond to it in a way that was very different than what they expected from a Christian. And it wasn't until I took, when I was during my degree, until I took a course, I think it was on Christianity and globalization or something. And we unpacked the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and what it meant and what the reality was and the difference between consent and non-consensual experiences and what the identity of women meant then versus the identity of men. And that's how I was able to not be homophobic anymore. Like, it's not like I was from the beginning, but I definitely had subconscious sort of biases and prejudices that existed that I wasn't acting on, but definitely existed. And until I was able to unpack that very academically and watch the difference between the things that I was reading versus the things that I had been told, that I was able to do that. And so are those conversations happening in the church? Are we looking at where these oppressions exist and how they were started to now? So another example I can give is like white supremacy. I said before, until the church recognizes that they are the ones who constructed white supremacy, I don't know that things are going to ever change. And the way in which we have to do that is, are we unpacking the differentiation between the Canaanites and Black people and Indigenous peoples and racialized peoples? Are we looking at what the story in the Bible is versus what history we know between sort of like the nation of Israel and the state of Israel, right? Like, are we looking at these things? Are we having conversations theologically about them? And if we're not, then we need to, because if we don't do that, the same way that my politics are impacted by my theology, like I said before, is the same way that the people who disagree with me are experiencing it, right? And so their theology is influencing their politics, which is influencing their experience with oppression and their perpetration of oppression. And so until we can have those conversations at sort of the pulpit, I don't know how we can change the culture in a way, unless people are committed to doing that. And I think it takes people who have power in the church or who have access to the rooms with power in the church to be able to say, we need to be teaching this, we need to be teaching that. Again, I'm not too familiar with your sort of structure. I only know it broadly, but like, for example, in my churches, if the deacons and the elders said, okay, this is what we're going to do now, then the pastor, that's who he listens to. So if those people who had power were all of a sudden to say, hey, we think racism is bad and we think homophobia is bad, let's discuss why we think so based on theology and then apply it to today. Then maybe things would be different in my churches, you know? So I think those conversations need to happen at the pulpit. And until they do, I don't know that the culture will change. And so that's why I say again that like the interpersonal relationships are so incredibly important, because if what's being set up at the front is not affirming or like is affirming, but is still not 100% or whatever sort of leeway there is there, if people know that the person standing next to them is there to support them and help them and be there for them in fellowship and in whatever way they can, it's a lot easier to confront what's happening at the front.
Well, I think we're very fortunate that our minister is affirming, does preach from the pulpit those values, and was the one that brought us into becoming an affirming congregation.
Yeah, that's great.
That's why most of us are here.
Yeah, that has definitely made a difference to our congregation, that's for sure. And we have been doing a lot of organized learning programs for the last 20 years. We do these sorts of things and theological studies and Bible studies and interfaith conversations, and we're really big on educating ourselves. So we're well-meaning, we just need to know, a little more about what we should be doing. So
Yeah, I think that's where sort of like the go-to Christianity piece comes in, right? Is that we can recognize that everybody in our space is well-meaning to a certain extent, and have those conversations in a way that you can't necessarily have outside of the church. And so that's why I separate sort of the work that I do externally and internally to the church, because I have to speak to it differently. When it comes to church community, you're talking about very often diverse group of people, even if it's not ethnically diverse, but still diverse in other ways, coming together over shared common ground that is very much their entire identity, right? And so when it's that level of devotion, we need to have some sort of way to talk about it that that surrounds that same devotion. And so I think the well-meaningness will come across as you support people in your congregation. I think it's so much easier to like put out statements and do external work than it is to look inside and see who's struggling and who's not feeling welcomed and who's still feeling oppressed, who's still experiencing harm within the church. And that's where we need to build spaces like this to find out. So for example, when I was in Montreal, the church my parents actually got married in, St. John's United, they had what I didn't know at the time was a trans flag outside. They had like a trans support group for trans Christians. And I'd never seen that before. I didn't even know what the flag was at the time. And now I'm just like, why does every church not have this space available, right? And not being like taught by cis het people in the church, but by other trans folks in the church, and curated by the communities that exist internally. So I think there's room to continue doing things like this and making spaces like this. But the biggest sort of active measure you can take is challenging the people who have the power, right? Challenging them to do more, forcing your hand, honestly, particularly when it comes to money and things like that in the church is unfortunately the capitalist society that we live in. And the only way things get done, right, is when people are required to do something about it. So if they know they're going to lose members, if they know that that people are not going to be happy with them, it's far easier to make them pay attention and make a change than it is to say somebody is being harmed in this church and you need to do something about it, which I think is very counteractive to what Jesus teaches, but that's not for me to necessarily judge. But yeah, so I think just like using whatever power and privilege you have will demonstrate that you mean well without you having to go up to people and ask them to share their stories and their experiences.
Anybody else have any comments, questions, observations? Yeah, okay, well, we've been almost the hour and a half anyway, so thank you all for coming. Thank you, Serisha.
Thank
That
you
was
for having me.
awesome evening to us. Thank you so much. I think I can speak for everybody here that we really have listened, and I think we have learned something, and you've given us some ideas on where we can move from here because, you know, as Pat said, we're a congregation that moves. So we want to keep moving forward and doing what we need to do and what God has called us to do. So thank you very much. We
Thank you.
appreciate
Amen to
taking
that.
time out this evening to be with us. And we're going to get some rest.
Thank you. Yes, I'm done for the day. All
Thank
right.
you.
Have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.